Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to be talking about Chapter 5, all about groups and networks. Social groups form the building blocks for society and for most social interaction. The sociologist George Simmel argued that the key element in determining the form of social relations in a group is the size of the group. And he emphasized the differences between social relations in a dyad, or a group of two, versus a triad, or a group of three. Something to keep in the back of your mind? You're probably a member of many social groups without even realizing it. So, again, George talked about how there's a difference between a group of two, or a dyad, versus a group of three, or a triad. The dyad is the most intimate form of social life because the two members are mutually dependent on each other. If one member leaves the group ceases to exist. Something else that George Simmel talks about is that as groups grow, they become more stable at the cost of intimacy. When a third person joins a dyad to form a triad, that person can fill the role of one of three types of positions. So, the first role that the third person who joins from a dyad to a triad can be the mediator. And this is the person, and the role, or those expected behaviors that they take on, is to resolve conflict. Next is the tertius gaudens. And the tertius gaudens is the person who profits from disagreements from the others. The final way that the third person who goes and joins that dyad to form a triad, they can become the divided emperor, or divide and conquer. This is the person who purposefully breaks up the other two people, or dissembles that triad, and the dyad that they joined is no longer as strongly connected as they previously were. Figure 5.2, that is also seen in your book, talks about how group sizes grow, and that as they grow, they become more complex. And even though they grow in size, it weakens intimacy. As group size increases, the number of possible relationships increase. In a group of three, there are three possible relationships that exist. But in a group of four, 6 possible relationships exist. The more relationships there are in a group, the more likely it is that the group may be troubled by conflict or jealousy. Again, as group sizes increase, intimacy is what is at stake and often taken away. So we have George Simmel again and C.H. Conley. When we think about George Simmel and C.H. Conley, a couple of things that we need to think about with these social groups is that these two talk about different ways that groups larger than a dyad or triad can be characterized. So let's first start with George Simmel. He came up with 3 categories: small groups, parties, and large groups. According to Simmel, a small group is characterized by 4 factors: face-to-face interaction, unifocal, lack of formal arrangements, and equality. A party differs from a small group in that it's multifocal, meaning multiple focuses. The primary characteristic of a large group is that the presence of a formal structure that mediates interaction and consequently status differentiation, meaning there are multiple people from various backgrounds who are often differentiated but yet can coexist. When we look at C.H. Conley, we are essentially looking at how he identified 2 main types of groups: primary groups and secondary groups. There's also other group types, including in-groups, out-groups, and reference groups, which we'll talk about momentarily. When we think about Conley, he emphasized a distinction between what is called the primary and secondary groups. Primary groups are limited in the number of members, allowing for face-to-face interaction. The group is an end unto itself, rather than a means to an end. Secondary groups are marked by impersonal, instrumental relationships, or those that exist as a means to an end. When you look at figure 5.3, this is the Asch test. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Asch test, this was an experiment that was delivered in the 1940s that talked about group conformity, or how much people are influenced by the actions or norms of a group. With this famous line study, Asch showed that if a majority of people agree on something, the minority will often go along with it, even if they don't agree with the outcome, simply because they want to become part of the larger group and they're influenced by the actions or the norms of the larger group. As we previously talked about a couple slides ago, I want to focus on C.H. Conley, because in addition to primary and secondary groups, he also talks about in-groups, out-groups, and references group. When we think about these, an in-group is a powerful group, most often of the majority. An out-group is a stigmatized or less powerful group and usually part of the minority. The significance of in-groups and out-groups lies on their relative power to define what constitutes normal versus abnormal thoughts and behaviors. Then we have a reference group, and this is a group that helps us understand or make sense of our position in society relative to other groups. We often compare ourselves to other groups of people we don't know directly in order to make comparisons. That is what reference groups are. Let's start shifting from groups to networks. So now that we've talked about a number of different types of groups, let's talk about what a network is. So a social network is a set of relations, often a set of dyads, that are held together by ties between individuals. A tie is a set of stories that explains our relationship to the other members of our network, while a narrative is the sum of the stories contained in a series of ties. New technologies that offer social networking, like Snapchat or Facebook, for example, have made traditional social networks even more complex. One advantage of these technologies is that it's relatively easy to see some social networks. One disadvantage is that it's difficult to see the importance of these ties. When we think about our networks, we have to think about embeddedness. This refers to the degree to which ties are reinforced through indirect paths within a social network. The more embedded a tie is, the stronger it is. And remember, a tie is a set of stories that explains our relationship to the other members of our network. The more embedded a tie is, the stronger it is. In other words, the more indirect paths you make to another person, the stronger the relationship will be. There's also structural holes. A structural hole is a gap between network clusters or even between two people who would benefit from having that gap closed. Here's an example. Suppose your friend needs a job and your mom is the manager of the local supermarket. There's a structural hole between them, but because you know them both, you can bridge that gap by mediating between the two parties. We also need to think about social capital. But before we even go into this, something that it makes me think about is that it makes me think of the 6 degrees of separation. So the 6-degree theory proposes that each one of us is connected to every other person by social chains, of no more than 6 people, and is based on Stanley Milgram's experiments in the 60s. Duncan Watts modified Milgram's theory to one that points that while not everyone is connected to each other, at least half the people in the world are connected to each other through these 6 steps. So between you and me, there's at least 6 degrees of separation, or 6 different ties of people that all connect within our network that brings us to where we're at now. So let's go back to social capital. This is the information, knowledge of people or ideas, and connections that help individuals enter pre-existing networks or gain power in them. High amounts of social capital in a community generally means that it's tightly knit and can come together to face challenges and to make improvements. It makes me think about a number of different things, but many opinions exist about changes in social capital in the United States, especially over the last 50 years or so. Some people perceive a decline in civic engagement, while others argue that we have less time to devote to traditional community activities. And there's even another group that would say that the advent of the internet has created new ways of bringing people together, which leads us to figure 5.7. This is essentially looking at network analysts. Network analysts use the basic concepts about groups and social networks that we have discussed to investigate how group life shapes individual behaviors. So network analyst researchers are using these basic concepts about groups and social networks like embeddedness, the differences between dyads and triads, and group conformity. So something to think about, just as an example. Bierman and colleagues analyzed the sexual habits of teenagers using network analysis. Bierman and colleagues uncovered a hidden rule that governed this social network. They found lots of examples of triads where partners are traded within groups. But the main rule that seemed to govern these relationships was, quote unquote, no cycles of 4, which means you don't date the ex of your ex's current boyfriend or girlfriend. The most interesting aspect of the rule, sociologically speaking, is that no one was consciously aware of this pattern. Now we step into organizations. An organization is any social network that's defined by a common purpose and has a boundary between its membership and the rest of the social world. We have formal and informal organizations. Formal organizations have a set of governing structures and rules for their internal setup, while informal organizations do not. The organizational culture refers to the shared beliefs and behaviors within a social group. Organizational structures refer to the ways in which power and authority are distributed within an organization. We're finally going to talk about isomorphism. Isomorphism refers to a constraining process that forces one organization to resemble other organizations that face the same set of environmental conditions. So DiMaggio and Powell, they're part of a school of thought that are called the New Institutionalism, which tries to develop a sociological view of institutions. They're the ones that coined the phrase institutional isomorphism. For example, if you wanted to create a new college, you might decide that your institution, or in your institution rather, you don't want to give students grades. Instead, you want them to learn for the sheer joy of obtaining knowledge. Unfortunately, though, if your students want to transfer to another college or continue on to graduate school, they need their transcripts with their grades. Because the environment is already firmly established, you'll have to conform in creating your new college if you want students to keep coming to your college. That's an example of isomorphism. I hope that this was helpful for you today. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to reach out to me via email. Also, don't forget in the description box below, make sure that you answer that question and you upload a screenshot of your answer to the weekly YouTube extra credit assignment in order to get 1 point added to your final grade. Until next time, I hope everyone has a great day, and I'll see you. Take care.